Hello everyone! Today we're making a German Dirndl, and this is part 1 for the Dirndl dress. I am here in Germany right now, and at this time we have Oktoberfest, which is happening right now from September 21st to October 6th. And I happen to be really close to the original location, which is in Munich. And one of the most traditional things that you wear to this kind of event is a Dirndl and lederhosen. And a lot of them are really pretty, but they can be very expensive. So of course, I put it in my mind that I might as well try and make my own, since I happen to already have a pattern for one. So a lot of Dirndls are made in cotton, which I have a ton of, as I'm sure a lot of you know by now from all my tutorials. So make sure you pre-wash all your cotton fabrics before you start cutting. I am using the Burda 7057, so this is my first Burda pattern. I'm also lucky enough to have a great little fabric store nearby that had a small selection of the Dirndl hooks. And I made my own Petersham ribbon. So if you choose not to buy already made Petersham ribbon, I will show you how to make your own later in this video. The size measurements are on the actual pattern paper itself, so I'm posting that here so you can see, since it's not directly easy to find on the outside envelope. And I will be making my dress in a size 16. I will be making view B for this dress, but using view E for the skirt and the apron. Once you have everything you need, go ahead and start cutting out your pieces. I have 3 different fabrics and an interfacing. So starting off, we're going to add our interfacing to all of the bodice lining pieces. Apply the interfacing to the wrong side and iron it on. I am using the same fabric for my lining as I am the main bodice. So hopefully this doesn't get too confusing. I just had enough of this fabric to use for both. So one of the first new things that I've learned how to do is add piping. So I'm grabbing my piping and I'm going to add this to the outside edges of the bodice pieces 1 and 4. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take the raw edge of the piping and line it up with the raw edge of the outside pattern piece of the outside center front. And then I will pin this together. And I'm going to add this to the other center front as well as to the curved sides of the side backs. This piping has a 5/8 inch seam allowance to it, so I will be sewing them on at the 5/8 inch seam allowance. I do not have a piping foot, but I do have a zipper foot, which comes standard with most machines. So adding my zipper foot, I'm going to push the piping as close in to that needle as I possibly can. And I notice when I sew it starts to pop out a little bit, so I just happened to find this piece that came from a remote, and I'm just using this to press against the piping to keep it tucked under the zipper foot as I sew, because I'd rather use a plastic piece than my fingers, and so that way I avoid any traumatic experience, being that my fingers are so close to the needle. So I'm going to sew this on all the way down on all 4 pieces. So you'll have something that looks like this. And when you turn it underneath, you'll see that you have your nice little piped edge. Piping is pretty moldable, so you should be able to get around the curve pretty easily. Grab your side front piece, and we're going to take the center front and lay it on top, right sides together, making sure that you're lining up the middle front edge and not the side edge. Do this to the other side as well. Then taking the center back piece, you're going to add the side back piece, lining up the curves. And this is, I believe, called a princess seam. Start on one end and slowly adjust the edges to meet and line up and pin in place a little bit at a time, and you can get those curves to match correctly. So it shouldn't lay flat. There should be a sort of bulge once it's pinned together. Pin on the other side. Sew these on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance, just like you did when we were adding the piping. So you should be going over that same stitch that you made the first time sewing the piping on. We're going to match the front and back bodice sides with right sides together and pin this. as well as on the other side. And then these will sew at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open the seams, making sure that the piping seam allowance is facing away from the center front and the center back. So here's our bodice piece so far. Grab your skirt panels, and this will vary depending on the width of your fabric and how many panels you actually have that made your 162 inch piece. But just take your panels and lay 2 edges right sides together and pin that side, and continue this with however many panel pieces you have, leaving one section open. So we want to have a strip, we do not want to make a tube. Sew these seams at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron all your seams open. Going to the top of our skirt panel, we're going to do a gathering base stitch all along the top. So we're going to start with our 3 to 4 inch tail of thread. And we're going to start sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance base stitch. Leave a tail of thread at the end. And then do the same thing once again, but at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. A more in-depth video explaining how to do this will be linked down below. Taking the 2 top threads, we're going to firmly but gently pull to create our gathers, and you're just going to move them all the way across the top so you have a nice gathered skirt. You want this to be gathered to the length of the bottom of your bodice piece. Once you have the gathered length, move your gathers around to distribute them evenly. Grab your bodice piece and lay it right sides together, matching the raw edges with your skirt panel. Find the center in the back, and you're going to match it to the center of your skirt panel. Then match the sides so they line up evenly on both sides. And then from there you can pin the rest of the middle sections down in place so everything doesn't move. Sew these together at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron the seam allowance toward your bodice. Going to the center front open edges, we're going to grab our zipper. Open up your zipper and laying your zipper down with right sides together. Line up the raw edge of the right side of your zipper with the raw edge of the right side of your center front. We're going to line up the teeth so that they lay on the 5/8 inch seam allowance. And we want the little metal notch to be 5/8 inches from the top. Then pin this in place all the way down. And we're going to sew this on at the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, grab your zipper foot, making sure that the needle is on the same side as your teeth. And you're going to sew this on all the way down. And when you get to the bottom, you're just going to go as far as you can before you get to the zipper tab. Now we're going to do the same on the other side. Remember, we're doing right sides together. Raw edges on the same side. Teeth at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And the middle notch 5/8 inches below the top edge. Pin this down. And then zip up your zipper to make sure that it zips up correctly, to make sure that you lined it out right. And then we can sew this on at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This time switching your zipper foot over to the other side. and sew all the way down to right before the zipper tab. Match up the edges at the bottom and pin this together. And we're going to sew this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch right at the top under the zipper. Lay the rest of the bottom of the zipper down so the teeth are lined up in the middle of the seam. And we're going to go back and sew down each side of the bottom of the zipper. Remember, when sewing this down, you only want to be sewing it to the seam allowance and you don't want to get any part of the skirt stuck underneath. Make sure to backstitch at the top and bottom of each stitch so that everything is secure. Iron open this seam. I'm going to take some more of my piping and I'm going to add this all around my neckline. So on both sides of the front and along the back. I'm going to grab all my lining pieces and I'm going to sew these together the same way that I did the bodice piece, minus the piping. Once again, iron open all the seams. Lay your lining on top of the front bodice with right sides together. And we're going to start matching the neckline, the armholes, and down the zipper sides. Going to the top of the straps on the lining side only. Fold it down 5/8 inches from the top. And you can pin these in place. So go ahead and do it to all of your straps. Then on the bottom edge of the lining, fold up the corners 5/8 inches to match up with the front bodice seam and pin this in place on both sides. Sew all these down with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once again, for all of the piped edges, you're going to sew it like you were sewing on the piping, going over that same seam that you used to sew the piping on. When you get to the corner, just feel around for the edge of the piping and get as close to it as you can before you lift your presser foot and pivot your fabric to the new direction. Next, we're going to make some clips into all of our curves. So I'm just going to cut some little tiny triangles every inch or so, but you want to make sure not to cut past the thread. Clip off the corners on the zipper straight edge. And we're going to make a clip in that 90-degree neckline corner. Remember, as close to the thread as you can without cutting it. Do this on both sides. So once everything is cut up, we're going to turn this right side out. Lay out all the edges nice and neat and iron them in place. Then we're going to do a top stitch at a 1/8 inch around all of these edges to help keep everything in place. So just like before with the piped edges, I'm going to use my zipper foot, and doing this method just so happens to give me the nice 1/8 inch top stitch that I want on all those piped edges. On the armholes, just stitch a normal 1/8 inch seam allowance. As you can see, you can definitely sew right over all the piping. Make sure to back stitch right at the center front near the zipper. We're going to lay the front and back shoulder straps right sides together. And we're going to sew these at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, making sure not to catch that folded edge of the fabric in the stitch. If you're not doing piping, you're going to clip these corners off, but if you are, the side with the piping, I recommend trying to cut off a little bit of the seam allowance and fabric before the seam allowance that's holding the cord in, and leave the extra length of piping hanging over. But then you'll have that fabric taken away so that they become a little more movable, which you can see in the next step. We're going to open up the shoulder straps, and we're going to tuck the extra fabric in between the openings so they're hidden. Since I cut the cording so short, I wasn't able to hide them. I ended up having to put some fray checks so they won't ever unravel. But I figure if you have the extra piece of piping sticking out, it'll be easier to tuck underneath, so you'll have a neater finish. This is something I wish I could have done over, so hopefully I save you guys this mistake. And before we finish that, we're going to go to the bottom edge of our bodice lining, and we're going to fold up the bottom edge 5/8 inches and iron it in place all the way across. Then I'm going to lay the lining back over, lining up the seam allowances and pinning right where the seam allowances are. Slip stitch those shoulder seams closed, and then slip stitch the lining to the skirt all the way across the bottom edge as well. Going to the bottom of the skirt, do a serge or a zigzag stitch along the bottom edge all the way around. Then take your iron, fold up the bottom edge 1/4 inches and iron it down all the way around as well. I'm going to be adding a lace trim, and I'm using a very small one, so I'm going to line up the top edge of my trim right underneath that serged edge. And I'm going to sew this on just under the 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to catch the trim in the stitch as well. Start with an inch hangover of trim before you start sewing. Leave an inch at the end of your trim before you finish as well. That way you can meet them together and fold them over to hide those raw edges, so you have a nice finished trim edge. Grabbing my Dirndl hooks. This will vary depending on the style or design that you have and where you can sew them on. You're going to line up the spot that you're going to sew with the marks on the front bodice that you've made, and I'm going to line them out. And you're going to hand stitch these on just like you would a button. Now the way that I made my Petersham ribbon is I took 2 of the fabrics that I'm using. I've cut about 3 to 4 1.5 inch strips in each color. I've sewed the strips together, at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then laying the two color strips right sides together, I sewed each side at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I sewed one short end together at the 1/4 inch seam allowance to help turning it out. I turned this strip inside out and pressed it all in place. And that's how I got my double-sided strip here. But you want enough to make about a 5-yard length strip. So the way we're going to start this is, I think that the color you want showing most should be on top. We're going to make a pleat at every 5/8 inch. Make your first pleat at 5/8 inches going up and over first. So we have this little zigzag. Then measure out the next 5/8 inches, starting from the edge of that last fold, and fold that 5/8 inches underneath. So you should create a 1 1/4 inch little square that looks like this. Then press this in place to hold everything together. So once again, from here, measure from the last folded edge, tuck it over 5/8 inches, and then tuck it under 5/8 inches and iron in place. Go ahead and continue this all the way down. I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to line this up as close to that zipper as I can without covering it. And I'm going to line up the top edge right under my piping. And you want to go all along the neckline. We're going to sew this on right down the middle. When you get to the other end, just fold up the edge, and that will be the edge right under your last pleat, so that way you have a nice finished edge and you don't have any raw parts showing. So start off making sure everything's lined up right before that zipper. And you're going to do a back stitch to hold that little part in place. And then just continue sewing on. When you get to the corner, maneuver it, keeping it pleated as best as you can. It may get a little wonky, but that's all right when we do the next step. You just don't want it to be completely stretched out. So just pivot around, sewing small little sections at a time till you get around that corner. So I've gotten to the other end. I'm going to cut off my excess ribbon, fold under that raw edge so that the edges line up, and then back stitch again to hold it all in place. The last thing we're going to do is hand stitch the centers. So take your sewing needle and thread and tie a knot at the end. Place your sewing needle through the center. Make sure to try and catch some of the fabric of the bodice as well. Doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit. Then I'm going to go around this center about 3 times, making sure to pull tightly. And on the third one, I'm going to go right underneath as far as I can, and I'm going to tie a knot so that it's not showing. And that's how you make this trim. So you're going to do this with each little pleat that you have. Grab your 1/4 inch ribbon, and you're going to cut a 1 7/8 inch piece. Thread your ribbon through the hooks like you would any shoe with shoelaces. Take a lighter and burn the ends to keep them from fraying. Tie your bow. There you have it, your finished Dirndl dress. Man, was this a mission. There is so much hand stitching that I promise you a lot of sweat and blood will go into this. The piping was optional, but I'm so happy that I added it because it really adds a little bit more uniqueness, and it definitely ups the quality, as well as the little tiny dainty lace trim at the bottom. So you definitely don't have to add those if you don't want to. I did happen to use a regular zipper instead of an invisible zipper, zipper, but I happen to really enjoy the way that it looks either way. This is definitely no beginner project by any means, so please don't get frustrated if this is something that you're new at. Try putting together a few other things first before you attempt to make this dirndl. I have a part 2 coming up with the apron and the blouse, so please subscribe and hit the bell so that you get notified when I upload that one, which should be soon. I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye!